The flight attendant stormed down the aisle, her face tight with frustration. She stopped at seat 3A, staring down at the woman sitting there. "I need to see your ticket," she demanded, her voice sharp. But what she didn't know, what no one on that flight knew, was that the woman she was trying to humiliate wasn't just any passenger. She owned the airline, and in just a few hours, that flight attendant's entire world was about to fall apart. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The first-class cabin was quiet, the kind of stillness that came just before takeoff. Passengers were settling in, adjusting their seats, scrolling through their phones, or taking slow sips of their complimentary drinks. Among them, a woman sat near the window, her posture relaxed but her mind alert. Her name was Vivienne Mercer, and if anyone on this plane knew who she was, they certainly weren't acting like it, which was exactly how she preferred it. She never traveled with an entourage, never announced her presence. Her wealth was not the kind that demanded attention. It was the kind that moved silently, shaping entire industries without making a sound. Dressed in a sleek black turtleneck and fitted trousers, her presence was effortlessly elegant. The only sign of her status was the delicate gold bracelet on her wrist. Custom-made, one of a kind, but even that detail was easy to miss. The hum of conversation filled the cabin as a flight attendant made her way down the aisle, stopping at various seats to check on passengers. Her name was Elena Rowan, a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and a practiced professional smile. She'd been working for this airline for years and had built a reputation for being strict, efficient, and sometimes a little too assertive when it came to enforcing rules. As she approached Vivienne's seat, she slowed, her gaze narrowing slightly. She looked at Vivienne, then at the small leather bag tucked neatly under the seat in front of her. Something about the sight made her pause. "Excuse me, miss," Elena said, tilting her head. "I need to see your boarding pass." Vivienne blinked, caught off guard by the request. No one else in the cabin had been asked for theirs. The man across the aisle, an older businessman with salt and pepper hair, was sipping his champagne, undisturbed. The woman a few seats ahead was already flipping through a magazine, but here she was, being questioned. Still, Vivienne said nothing at first. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out the boarding pass and handed it over. Elena took it, her eyes scanning the details. Seat 3A, first-class ticket, everything checked out. But instead of handing it back, she hesitated. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her voice even but firm. Vivienne exhaled slowly, keeping her tone measured. "That's what the ticket says." The flight attendant didn't move. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder as if expecting someone to back her up. Another crew member, Hannah Whitman, passed by but didn't stop, though she gave Elena a curious look before continuing toward the galley. Passengers nearby had started paying attention. A man 2 rows behind, David Langston, shifted in his seat, pretending not to listen. But the curiosity was there. It always was. Elena let out a small, forced laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I'm just making sure. You know, sometimes mistakes happen with seating assignments." Mistakes. That was the word she chose. Not misunderstanding, not a system error. Mistake. Vivienne had seen this before. The polite questioning, the passive-aggressive suspicion, the way people like her were always expected to prove they belonged in spaces where others were never questioned. She held out her hand. "If there's an issue, I'd like my ticket back." Elena hesitated for a second longer before handing it over. Her fingers tightened around the slip of paper before finally letting go. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice clipped, before walking away. Vivienne slipped the ticket back into her bag. The air in the cabin felt different now. The silent eyes of other passengers were still on her, but no one said anything. No one ever did. She turned back to the window, watching as the last of the luggage was loaded onto the plane. It was going to be a long flight. What she didn't know yet was that Elena Rowan wasn't done with her, and when she came back, Things would take a turn that no one on this flight would ever forget. The plane had been in the air for almost an hour, the seatbelt sign long turned off. Most of the passengers had settled in, some watching movies, others dozing off, and a few flipping through magazines. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady background noise that drowned out most conversations. Vivienne Mercer remained in her seat, her fingers resting lightly against the armrest. She had put in her noise-canceling earbuds, though she wasn't listening to anything. Instead, she kept her eyes on the clouds outside the window, letting the altitude press against her thoughts. Then, just as she was beginning to relax, Elena Rowan returned. This time, her steps were quicker, her posture tighter. Something had shifted. Her presence alone sent a ripple through the quiet cabin. A few passengers looked up, sensing something was about to happen. Without a word, Elena stopped at seat 3A, her expression stiff, her lips pressed together in a way that suggested she had made up her mind about something. She folded her arms across her chest. "I need you to come with me," she said, her tone more commanding than before. Vivienne looked up slowly, taking a moment before responding. "Excuse me?" Elena exhaled sharply, her patience clearly wearing thin. "I need to have a conversation with you in private," she repeated. "Now." Passengers nearby exchanged glances, the tension creeping into the air. David Langston, the businessman across the aisle, lowered his drink slightly, watching with quiet curiosity. Vivienne removed one earbud, tilting her head slightly. "If there's something you need to say, you can say it here." Elena's nostrils flared. "This isn't a discussion. I'm asking you to step out of your seat." Vivienne remained still, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "And if I don't?" The muscles in Elena's jaw tightened. "Then I'll have to involve security when we land." That was when the murmurs started, soft, quiet whispers between passengers. The unease in the cabin thickened. This was no longer just a minor exchange. This was turning into something bigger. Hannah Whitman, the younger flight attendant, had been standing near the galley when she noticed what was happening. She frowned, setting down a tray and quickly making her way over. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between Elena and Vivienne. Before Vivienne could respond, Elena spoke for her. "She's refusing to cooperate." Hannah blinked, caught off guard. "With what?" Elena didn't answer right away. She hesitated for the first time, as if she didn't expect to be questioned herself. Vivienne leaned back in her seat, her eyes never leaving Elena's. "She hasn't actually said why she wants me to move. I think we'd all like to hear it." Hannah's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Elena, what's going on?" Passengers were listening now. Even those who had been pretending not to watch were fully tuned in. Elena shifted on her feet, but she didn't back down. Instead, she took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and spoke clearly. "I don't believe she's supposed to be in this seat," she said. Silence. Vivienne exhaled through her nose. "I showed you my ticket." Elena kept her gaze firm. "And I need to verify it again." A scoff came from a few rows back. One of the passengers, Mia Reynolds, a woman in her mid-30s with glasses and an annoyed expression, shook her head. "You've got to be kidding me." Hannah's face paled slightly. She looked at Vivienne, then back at Elena. "You already checked her ticket?" Elena didn't answer right away. Hannah sighed, rubbing her temple. "Look, if there was an issue, we should have handled it before takeoff. We can't keep harassing passengers." Elena's face turned a shade darker, but she refused to back down. "I am following airline policy." Vivienne finally moved, reaching into her bag. She pulled out her ticket, slow and deliberate, and held it up for everyone around her to see. "Here," she said, her voice level. "Go ahead. Verify it again." Elena hesitated just a second too long. Hannah snatched the ticket before Elena could and skimmed over it. A second later, she let out a breath and shot Elena a look. "She's in the right seat." More murmurs from passengers. David Langston set down his drink entirely now, watching with a raised brow. Elena's fingers twitched. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. But instead of apologizing, instead of backing away, she made one final mistake. She grabbed Vivian's arm. Not hard, not enough to hurt, but enough to be seen, enough to be felt. The gasp that rippled through the cabin was instant. A few passengers actually stood up in shock. Vivian, however, remained perfectly still. Hannah's face drained of color. Elena. Elena pulled her hand back quickly, as if she had just realized what she had done. But it was too late. Vivian's lips curled slightly, not in a smile, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous. She reached for her phone, her movements calm, too calm. Elena took a step back, something in her chest tightening. Vivian pressed a single button on her screen, lifting the phone to her ear. And when she spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't a yell. It was controlled. Gate control. This is Vivian Mercer, owner of Mercer Airlines. There's been an incident on Flight 748. Elena's world started to cave in. The moment the words left Vivian Mercer's lips, the entire cabin shifted. The tension in the air, already thick, became suffocating. The murmurs from passengers stopped. Every eye in the first-class cabin snapped toward her, toward the woman who had just spoken her name with effortless authority, owner of Mercer Airlines. The realization rippled like a shockwave. Elena Rowan's breath hitched. Her body stiffened, her throat tightening as if the air around her had suddenly vanished. No, this wasn't possible. She had been so certain, so sure that this woman didn't belong in first class. And yet here she was, making a call to the very people who controlled the skies she worked under. Vivian remained composed, her voice steady as she spoke into the phone. "There's been an incident with a member of your in-flight crew," she said smoothly. "I'll be filing a formal report upon landing." Elena opened her mouth, but no words came out. She felt her heartbeat hammering against her ribs, pounding in her ears so loudly that it drowned out the sound of everything else. Hannah Whitman was the first to react, stepping forward cautiously. "Ms. Mercer," she said carefully, the name tasting foreign in her mouth. I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Vivian lifted a hand, silencing her instantly. She wasn't interested in apologies. Not yet. The passengers had gone from silent curiosity to full-blown shock. Some of them were now whispering frantically, exchanging wide-eyed glances. David Langston, who had been watching the entire exchange, let out a low chuckle under his breath. "Well, this just got interesting." Elena finally found her voice, though it was shaky. "Ms. Mercer," she stammered, if I had known, you would have treated me differently." Vivian finished for her, her tone calm but sharp enough to cut through steel. Elena's stomach twisted. This was it. She had been in the airline industry for over 15 years. She had dealt with demanding passengers, entitled customers, people who thought they were above rules. But never in her entire career had she ever mishandled a situation this badly. And she knew. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Vivian lowered her phone from her ear, letting the weight of the silence stretch between them. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't have to make a scene. Everyone was already witnessing her power without her even trying. The voice on the other end of the line finally spoke back, though only Vivian could hear them. She listened for a moment before responding. "Yes, I'll stay in my seat. But when we land, I expect an immediate meeting with the flight supervisor and corporate HR. And I want her," she gestured toward Elena without looking at her, "escorted off the plane upon arrival." Elena felt her knees lock. "Wait," she blurted. "Please, Ms. Mercer, this was just a mistake," Vivian interrupted, tilting her head slightly. "That's what you called it earlier, isn't it?" Elena's mouth opened, then closed. Vivian studied her, the silence stretching long enough to make the flight attendant wilt under her gaze. Then, finally, she spoke again, slow and deliberate. "Tell me," she said, voice soft but lethal. "Why exactly did you think I wasn't supposed to be in this seat?" The entire cabin was watching now. No one was pretending to look away. Hannah stood frozen, her fingers clutching the tray she had been holding earlier. David Langston leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Mia Reynolds, the woman who had scoffed earlier, crossed her arms, her face filled with vindication. Elena's face burned. She started, but she had nothing. No explanation. No excuse that wouldn't sound pathetic in this moment. Vivienne didn't need to say anything else. She had already won, and Elena knew it. Elena's breath came faster than she wanted it to. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, heavy and unforgiving. Every second that passed with Vivienne Mercer staring at her made it worse. She had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots, the one who kept things in order. But now, she wasn't just losing control. She had already lost it. Passengers continued watching, their faces a mixture of shock, curiosity, and satisfaction. Some had already guessed why she had singled Vivienne out in the first place, and now they were waiting to see if she would say it out loud. Vivienne leaned back in her seat, her movements effortless as if she had all the time in the world. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was something far more dangerous. "I'm waiting," she said, tilting her head slightly. Elena's mouth felt dry. She tried to swallow, but it was useless. What could she say? That she hadn't assumed Vivienne didn't belong? That would be a lie. And saying the truth, that was career suicide. Hannah Whitman, still standing nearby, looked deeply uncomfortable. She wasn't stupid. She had worked with Elena long enough to know that she had a habit of making certain passengers feel unwelcome. Not the loud, obvious kind of discrimination, but the quiet, polite on the surface kind. The kind that people like Vivienne Mercer noticed immediately. Elena forced a breath through her nose. She needed to fix this. "Now, she started, forcing her voice into something steadier. "I was just following standard procedures, Miss Mercer. It had nothing to do with—" Vivienne lifted a single brow, daring her to finish that sentence. Elena stopped. Passengers were still watching. Some of them had their phones out now, recording. Not obviously, but enough that she could see the way screens were angled, waiting for her next words, waiting to see if she would dig her own grave. Vivienne let the silence stretch long enough to make Elena's skin crawl. Then, with the same level tone, she spoke again. "You asked for my ticket," she said, tapping the armrest lightly. "Fine. Maybe you were just being thorough." Elena exhaled shakily. Maybe this was her way out. "But," Vivienne continued, "you didn't ask for his." She gestured lightly toward David Langston, who had been watching with open amusement. The older businessman lifted his champagne glass in a slight toast, as if to confirm that he, indeed, had not been questioned. Vivienne's gaze flicked to the woman a few seats ahead. Or hers. Mia Reynolds crossed her arms, shaking her head. "Nope. She didn't ask me a thing." Vivienne's gaze returned to Elena. "Just me." Elena felt her face heat. Hannah shifted uncomfortably beside her, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else but here. "So," Vivienne said, her voice light but cutting through the air like a blade. "Tell me, what exactly made me the only passenger worth questioning?" Elena's nails dug into the fabric of her uniform. She had no answer. No answer that wouldn't make this worse. Vivienne didn't blink, didn't look away. She was making her sit in it. The shame, the humiliation, the weight of her own poorly calculated choice. Then Vivienne did something that made Elena's stomach drop even further. She smirked. Just barely. She knew. She knew Elena had no way out of this. Passengers were whispering now, phones were still recording. And then Vivienne spoke again, this time her voice smooth and effortless. "Tell me, Ms. Rowan," she said, using Elena's name for the first time, making it sound like a death sentence. "What do you think happens when a flight attendant lays hands on the owner of an airline?" Elena's entire body went cold, because she already knew the answer. Elena's throat felt tight, her breathing shallow. The reality of what she had just done hit her like a collapsing building, slow at first, then all at once. The whispers around the cabin were growing louder, mixing with the soft hum of the engines. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting for the fall. Hannah's voice broke through the tension. Quiet but firm. "Elena," she said, barely above a whisper. "You need to step away." Elena's fingers twitched at her sides. Step away? That was it? After 15 years of flawless service, one mistake and suddenly, she was the villain? No. She could fix this. She had to. "Ms. Mercer," Elena forced out, her voice tense but controlled. I deeply regret if my actions have caused any misunderstanding. I was only trying to— To what? Vivian interrupted smoothly, her expression unreadable. Elena swallowed hard. Vivian tilted her head, waiting. The same unbearable silence stretched between them, dragging her down, drowning her. David Langston chuckled from across the aisle, shaking his head. "Give it up," he muttered under his breath, but just loud enough for Elena to hear. Mia Reynolds let out a small scoff. "She's really trying to clean up her mess now." Elena clenched her fists. "Ms. Mercer, You grabbed my arm," Vivian cut in. Elena froze. The words weren't shouted. They weren't even spoken with anger. But the precision of them? The way they landed like a final, undeniable fact? It sealed everything. More whispers. The weight of passengers' eyes burned into Elena's skin. Phones were still pointed, recording every last moment. Vivian turned slightly in her seat, looking at Hannah. "Do you know what the standard policy is when a crew member touches a passenger unnecessarily?" Hannah hesitated before answering, her voice quiet but certain. "It's grounds for immediate termination." Elena's heart stopped. Vivian exhaled lightly. "So, tell me, Ms. Rowan." She turned back to her, her smirk gone now, replaced with something colder. "Should I follow airline policy, or should I make an exception?" Elena opened her mouth, panic surging through her veins. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't fair. She had to say something. She had to fix this. "Ms. Mercer, please," she finally said, her voice cracking, the first real crack in the wall of control she had built for herself. I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake. A terrible one." Vivian didn't respond right away. She let the moment hang, let Elena sit in it. Then slowly she leaned forward just slightly. "I know." It was the calm finality in her voice that shattered Elena completely. Because that wasn't forgiveness. That was a verdict. And Elena knew exactly what was waiting for her when this plane landed. Elena's stomach churned as the full weight of her actions settled over her. Her uniform, once crisp and perfectly tailored, suddenly felt suffocating. The murmurs around her grew louder, passengers exchanging knowing glances, their expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. She had lost control of the situation, completely. Vivian Mercer had never raised her voice, never lost her composure, never even demanded an apology. And that was what made it worse, because now Elena wasn't just a flight attendant trying to correct a mistake. She was the woman who had humiliated the owner of the airline and done it in front of a plane full of witnesses. Hannah shifted beside her, clearing her throat. "Elena," she said again, firmer this time. "You need to step away, now." Elena felt like her feet were glued to the floor. She didn't get to finish. The intercom crackled to life and the captain's voice filled the cabin, calm but commanding. "Elena Rowan, please report to the cockpit immediately." The murmurs stopped. A sharp jolt of panic ran through Elena's chest. No, this was happening too fast. Passengers turned to look at each other, their expressions shifting from curiosity to full-blown anticipation. David Langston let out a low chuckle. "Oh, that's not good." Mia Reynolds smirked. "She's cooked." Elena's hands felt clammy. The entire plane was watching her downfall in real time. Her mind raced for a way out, a way to reverse the damage, to take control back. But there was no fixing this. Vivian, still seated, exhaled lightly, glancing at her nails before speaking, low and controlled. "I think they're waiting for you." That was it. That was all she said. But it was enough. Elena's breath hitched, her fingers twitching at her sides. The walk to the cockpit felt like a funeral march. Passengers didn't pretend not to watch anymore. They turned their heads, some smirking, some shaking their heads, some still secretly recording. Each step felt heavier than the last. As she reached the cockpit door, Hannah's voice followed her, soft but deadly. "You really should have just checked her ticket and moved on." Elena squeezed her eyes shut for half a second, her hands shaking as she pressed the intercom button. "This is Elena," she forced out, reporting to the cockpit. The door clicked open, and as she stepped inside, her career, her entire world, hung by a single thread. The cockpit door closed behind Elena Rowan with a quiet but decisive click. The small, dimly lit space was nothing like the first-class cabin she had just left. Here, there were no watching passengers, no murmuring whispers, no recording phones. But somehow the silence felt heavier, worse. Captain Robert Hughes turned in his seat, his expression unreadable. He had been flying for over 2 decades, long enough to know that when corporate got involved in a mid-flight situation, someone's career was about to crash harder than any failed landing. Beside him, First Officer Dennis Carter kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the controls, but the tension in his posture was obvious. The in-flight phone was still connected, the faint static from the other end of the line humming through the small space. Elena didn't need to guess who was on the other side. Corporate had been notified. Captain Hughes exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple before looking at her. "You've really done it this time, Rowan." Elena's mouth felt dry. "Captain, He lifted a hand, cutting her off. "Sit." She hesitated before obeying, lowering herself into the small fold-out seat near the door. "Do you have any idea who you just put your hands on?" the captain asked, his voice deceptively calm. Elena swallowed. I didn't know. Not good enough." His voice hardened. Elena flinched slightly, gripping the edges of her uniform. Captain Hughes leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You know how many complaints I get from passengers who feel like they've been mistreated?" He let the question sit for a beat before answering it himself. "Too many, and most of them don't have the power to do anything about it." He narrowed his eyes at her. "But this time, you picked the one person who does." Elena's hands trembled in her lap. "You embarrassed the owner of the airline," the captain continued. "You questioned her, humiliated her, physically touched her, and you did it all in front of a plane full of witnesses." Elena's stomach churned. I was just enforcing policy." "No, you weren't," the captain cut in, his voice sharp. "You were enforcing your own bias. And now, you're going to answer for it." The radio crackled. A new voice came through, calm but authoritative. "This is James Connors, Senior Operations Manager. I've been briefed on the situation. Captain Hughes, please confirm if the crew member in question is in the cockpit." The captain pressed the in-flight phone to his ear. "She's here." A beat of silence. Then James Connors' voice returned, colder this time. "Elena Rowan, you are being relieved of duty effective immediately." Elena stopped breathing. The captain watched her carefully, waiting for the reality to sink in. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Relieved of duty? Mid-flight? That never happened. James continued, his voice unwavering. "Upon landing, you will be escorted off the aircraft and placed on administrative leave, pending a formal review with the airline's executive board." Elena's vision blurred. Her fingers dug into her skirt as she fought to steady her breath. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "This is my career. I didn't mean to." "Irrelevant," James said coldly. "A formal letter will be sent to your email within the hour outlining your next steps. Until then, I strongly advise you to remain professional and not create further disruption." Another silence. Then James spoke again, his words final. "We land in 30 minutes. I suggest you prepare for the consequences." The line went dead. Elena felt her chest tighten. She had spent 15 years flying, and now, in 15 minutes, she had thrown it all away. Captain Hughes let out a long breath, shaking his head. "I suggest you take a seat in the back, Rowan. You're a passenger now." Elena sat frozen, her entire world crumbling beneath her. And back in first class, Vivian Mercer took another slow sip of her drink, waiting for the wheels to hit the ground. She wasn't done yet. Elena's steps felt heavy as she left the cockpit. Every fiber of her being told her to keep walking, to get to the back of the plane as quickly as possible, to disappear before the humiliation became unbearable. But it was already too late. The moment she stepped back into the first-class cabin, every single pair of eyes turned toward her. She could feel it. The silent judgment, the quiet smirks, the barely contained satisfaction from passengers who had watched her fall from authority to nothing in a matter of minutes. She didn't dare make eye contact with Vivienne Mercer. Not that it mattered. Vivienne didn't even look at her. That was worse. She wasn't worth her attention anymore. Elena's breath came in short, shallow bursts as she forced herself to move, her feet carrying her away from the front of the plane, the place she had ruled over for years. Hannah Whitman was standing near the galley, arms crossed. She didn't say anything as Elena passed, but there was something in her expression that made Elena's stomach twist even further. Pity. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of satisfaction. As Elena finally reached the back of the plane, the space felt smaller than she remembered, more cramped, more suffocating. There was an empty seat near the rear exit, the same kind of seat she had once sent passengers to when she decided they didn't belong in first class. Now, it was hers. She sank into it, staring straight ahead, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built was collapsing around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. At the front of the plane, Vivienne Mercer let out a quiet breath, stretching her legs slightly. Mia Reynolds leaned over from her seat, raising an eyebrow. Not even gonna look at her. Vivienne smirked faintly. She's not my problem anymore. David Langston chuckled. Cold. Vivienne picked up her phone, scrolling casually. Just business. And just like that, Elena Rowan ceased to exist. Not because Vivienne had to destroy her, because she had already destroyed herself. The plane cruised steadily through the air, but for Elena Rowan it might as well have been plummeting. She sat stiffly in her cramped economy seat, her breathing shallow, her hands gripping her knees as if holding herself together. The murmur of conversations around her felt distant, like she was underwater, drowning in the consequences of her actions. She didn't belong here. For 15 years, she had walked through these aisles with authority. She had given orders, dictated the rules, ensured that everything in her section was exactly as it should be. She controlled the cabin. Now she was just another passenger. No, it was worse than that. Passengers still had dignity. They still had the ability to get off this plane and go about their lives. Elena had no idea what was waiting for her when they landed. Her mind raced with what was coming. The formal review, the executive board, the end of her career. Because, let's be honest, there was no coming back from this. She could already see the headlines in her mind. Mercer Airlines flight attendant harasses owner in first class, then puts hands on her. She could already hear the corporate response. We take incidents like this very seriously and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with respect. She could already picture the press release. Effective immediately, Elena Rowan has been dismissed from her role with Mercer Airlines. Her stomach twisted violently. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was career suicide. And the worst part? She had done this to herself. A small voice in her head, the one she had ignored for years, whispered the truth. You thought she didn't belong there. You looked at her and assumed she was in the wrong seat. You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket. Just her. And when she had challenged you, you had doubled down. And then, you put your hands on her. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, swallowing down the rising nausea. This wasn't fair, but wasn't it? She didn't even need to turn around to know that Vivienne Mercer was still seated comfortably in first class, unfazed. That woman had barely lifted a finger, and yet she had taken everything from her. Not because of a tantrum, not because she had shouted or demanded some ridiculous compensation, but because she didn't have to. Because power doesn't need to scream. Elena flinched as she felt movement next to her. A flight attendant, Angela, one of the newer crew members, had come up beside her, crouching slightly. "Elena," she said in a quiet voice. Elena turned her head slowly, hating how Angela's tone sounded. Gentle, careful, like she was already speaking to a former employee. Angela hesitated. "I wanted to check if you're okay." Elena stiffened. No one had ever asked her that before. Not like this. She had spent her entire career making other people uncomfortable. And now, here she was, on the receiving end of it, and she had no idea how to handle it. "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying her. Angela hesitated before nodding. "We land in 15 minutes. Elena already knew that. She had been counting down the minutes. She said nothing. Angela stood back up, pressing her lips together before walking away. Elena's fingers twitched. 15 minutes. That was all she had left. 15 minutes before she stepped off this plane. Not as a senior flight attendant, not as someone respected, not as someone who had control, but as a woman who had ruined everything in a matter of seconds. And when she stepped off that plane, she knew Vivian Mercer would be waiting. Elena barely heard the captain's voice over the intercom announcing the descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and all tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." The words barely registered. Her hands felt cold, her chest tight. 15 minutes. 14 now. She didn't move, didn't look around. She kept her gaze locked on the seat in front of her, staring blankly at the safety instructions tucked into the pocket. She had never been the kind of flight attendant who felt nervous before landing. But then again, she had never landed knowing she would walk off the plane in disgrace. Angela passed by again, checking on passengers. This time, she didn't say anything to Elena. She just gave her a small, unreadable glance before moving on. In first class, Vivian Mercer sat comfortably, her seat reclined slightly, sipping on what was left of her sparkling water. She was calm. She had been calm since the moment this started. Mia Reynolds leaned in from her seat, unable to hide her smirk. "So, what happens when we land?" Vivian didn't look away from her phone. "She gets escorted off the plane." David Langston chuckled from across the aisle. "That's it?" Vivian finally glanced up, tilting her head slightly. "You want more?" David shrugged. "You're the owner of the airline. Could have had her fired on the spot." Vivian smiled faintly. "She fired herself the second she put her hands on me." Mia snorted. "She doesn't even realize how bad this is yet." "Oh, she will," Vivian murmured, locking her phone screen. "She will." The plane tilted slightly, signaling the final descent. Elena forced herself to focus on breathing. In, outside. She could feel eyes on her. She didn't need to look to know that people were watching. Some pretending not to, some openly staring. She had been the authority once. The one people feared. The one who enforced the rules. And now, she was the lesson. The one who had let her own biases write the end of her career. She didn't even try to justify it anymore, because there was nothing to justify. She had made assumptions about Vivian Mercer, not because she had done anything wrong, not because she had acted suspiciously, but because of the kind of person she had expected to see in first class. And when Vivian had pushed back, she had doubled down. And now, here she was. The irony burned in her throat. The plane shuddered as the wheels hit the runway. A few passengers applauded softly, a habit on some flights, but this time the clapping felt different. It felt like the closing act of a very public downfall. A quiet hum of voices filled the cabin as the plane slowed. Elena could feel it, the anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. Vivian Mercer sat back in her seat, rolling her neck slightly before stretching her fingers. The game was over. The curtain was closing. And now, it was time for consequences. The plane came to a full stop. The intercom clicked on one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Thank you for flying with us. Ding. The seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers moved immediately, grabbing bags, stretching, adjusting their jackets. Elena didn't move. She didn't dare, because standing at the front of the plane, waiting just outside the door, were two uniformed security officers. And in the first row of first class, Vivian Mercer finally stood up. She wasn't done yet. Elena stayed frozen in her seat. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her fingers digging into her lap as she stared at the seat in front of her. She knew what was waiting for her outside that plane. And the worst part? There was no escape. The aisle filled with passengers grabbing their bags, stretching after the long flight, whispering amongst themselves. But there was no mistaking the fact that many of them weren't just preparing to leave. They were waiting to see what would happen to her. Vivian Mercer moved effortlessly, standing tall, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer as she stepped into the aisle. Calm, unbothered, untouchable. She had won this game before it even started. And Elena? Elena had already lost. Mia Reynolds leaned toward Vivian slightly, speaking just loud enough for Elena to hear. Bet she's regretting that little power trip now. David Langston smirked. Oh, she hasn't even hit the worst part yet. Elena clenched her jaw. She refused to look at them. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing just how broken she felt. Hannah appeared near the front of the plane, avoiding Elena's gaze as she spoke to Vivienne. Security is ready, she said quietly. Vivienne simply nodded, as if she expected nothing less. Passengers slowly began filing off, one by one, but Elena knew she wouldn't be among them. She would be the last. She would be escorted. She would be paraded through the terminal like a warning sign. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Vivienne moved forward, her heels clicking against the cabin floor as she approached the exit. When she reached the front, she paused briefly, turning her head just enough to speak over her shoulder. Elena. Elena's breath caught. This was it. This was her reckoning. Slowly, painfully, she forced herself to look up. Vivian held her gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Instead, she said something far worse. I want you to remember this moment, she said smoothly, her voice carrying power with no effort at all. Elena swallowed hard. Not because of what's happening to you, Vivian continued, but because of what you did to yourself. Silence. Deep. Unforgiving. Then Vivian turned away, stepping off the plane as if none of this had ever affected her in the first place. Elena felt something crack inside her, because she was right. This wasn't just about what Vivian had done to her. It was about what she had done to herself. A moment later, a firm voice spoke from the front of the plane. Elena Rowan? She stiffened. The security officers. She turned her head just slightly. Two men in Navy uniforms. Calm, professional, but firm. Elena swallowed down the lump in her throat. You need to come with us. Passengers stopped pretending not to watch. This was what they had been waiting for. Elena had no choice. Her legs shook as she stood, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. Every step toward the front of the plane felt heavier than the last. She walked past the seats she had once ruled over, past the passengers who had once feared her authority, past Hannah, whose lips were pressed into a tight line, past the first-class cabin where Vivian Mercer had sat, unbothered, powerful, untouchable. And then finally she stepped off the plane. The bright lights of the terminal hit her like a spotlight, and waiting just a few feet ahead, a man in a dark suit, expression unreadable, posture unshaken. James Connors, Senior Operations Manager. Her judgment was waiting. The terminal air felt different, colder, heavier. Elena stepped off the plane, flanked by the two uniformed security officers, and the world around her seemed to slow down. Eyes followed her every movement. Some passengers had already moved on, disappearing into the airport corridors. Others, they lingered, not out of concern, not out of curiosity. but to watch. She was no longer a flight attendant, no longer the one in charge. She was the scandal, the show, the downfall. James Connors stood near the gate, his sharp suit neatly pressed, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't frown, didn't scowl, didn't glare. That would have been mercy. Instead, he looked at her with the kind of calm indifference that told her exactly where she stood. She was nothing now. "Elena Rowan," he said, his voice smooth but heavy. "Final." She swallowed hard. "Mr. Connors, walk with me." No negotiation, no option. Elena hesitated for half a second, but she knew. She had no choice. The security officer stepped aside as James turned on his heel, already leading the way through the terminal. She followed, her legs feeling like lead. The airport bustled with life, passengers hurrying toward their gates, families greeting loved ones, business travelers checking their phones. None of it felt real. All Elena could feel was the crushing weight of each step. They walked in silence, past the bustling crowds, past the flight information screens flickering with schedules, past the familiar sight of crew members in crisp uniforms. She had walked this same path dozens, maybe hundreds of times before. But this time it wasn't her terminal anymore. They reached a set of frosted glass doors. James swiped his ID badge and they slid open without hesitation, leading into a quiet, restricted corridor. The world behind them faded. No more passengers. No more whispers. Just a long hallway with a single meeting room at the end. Elena's breathing hitched. She knew this room. She had seen other employees walk in over the years, and none of them had walked out the same. James stepped inside, motioning toward a chair. "Sit." Elena hesitated. "I won't say it again." Her throat tightened as she moved forward, lowering herself onto the seat. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. James sat across from her, folding his hands over a neat stack of papers. He took his time, flipping through the first few pages. Elena tried to steady her breath, but the silence was unbearable. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know how many reports I have in front of me?" She swallowed. He didn't let her finish. 17, he said, flipping another page. 17 witness statements, some from passengers, some from crew members. He glanced up at her. Even the pilot filed one. Elena's blood turned to ice. "The pilot?" James continued. "Each statement confirms that you questioned a first-class passenger without cause, dismissed a valid ticket, and escalated a situation that should have never happened." She opened her mouth, maybe to defend herself, maybe to beg, but he didn't stop. "And then," he said, voice still eerily calm, "you put your hands on her." Elena flinched. James leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I need you to understand something, Rowan. This isn't just about the fact that you humiliated a passenger. This isn't just about you being unprofessional." He let the silence stretch for a moment. Then his next words came like a sentence being handed down. "You put your hands on Vivian Mercer." Elena's body locked up. James tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Let me say that again, in case you didn't grasp it the first time." He leaned in just slightly. "You laid hands on the owner of this airline." Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. James exhaled, leaning back, tapping his fingers against the file in front of him. "Do you have anything to say?" Her lips parted, but no words came. What could she say? That she didn't know? That it had been a mistake? That she hadn't meant to put her hands on the single most powerful woman in the company? None of it would save her. None of it would even help. She had spent years keeping order, making passengers feel small when she felt like they didn't belong. And now, she was the one who didn't belong. James tapped the file one last time before flipping it closed. "The board has already made their decision," he said simply. Elena's stomach turned. James pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. She didn't need to read the words to know what it said, but she read them anyway. Effective immediately, Elena Rowan is permanently dismissed from Mercer Airlines. This decision is final. Any attempts to contest this termination will be denied. It was over. Just like that. 15 years. Gone. James stood, gathering the rest of his paperwork. "You have 5 minutes to clear out your belongings from company storage," he said. "Your ID badge has been deactivated. You are no longer permitted in any restricted areas of this airport." Elena stared at the paper. She had known this was coming. She had known from the second Vivian Mercer had spoken her name, but knowing didn't make it any easier. James gave her one last look, unreadable, before heading toward the door. He paused just before leaving, speaking without turning around. "One last thing." Elena barely lifted her eyes. "You didn't just lose your job today, Rowan." His voice was steady, calm, but final. "You lost your entire career." Then the door closed behind him, and Elena Rowan was officially nothing. Elena sat in the empty room, staring at the termination letter in front of her. Her hands shook. The words blurred together, the ink smudging as her vision wavered. She wasn't crying, not yet. The shock hadn't fully let her. Effective immediately, permanently dismissed, no right to contest. Each phrase felt like a fresh cut, like she was reading her own obituary. Her mouth was dry. Her uniform, the same one she had worn with pride and authority for years, now felt foreign on her body. It was no longer hers. Nothing was. The silence in the room was deafening. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. 15 years. Gone. Not just this job. All jobs. Because who would hire a flight attendant fired for humiliating and laying hands on the owner of an airline? Her career wasn't just over. It was erased. A sharp knock on the door snapped her out of her trance. Elena's breath hitched as the door pushed open, and a woman stepped inside. She froze. Vivian Mercer. For a split second, neither of them spoke. Elena's fingers twitched over the paper. She didn't dare move. Vivian's posture was relaxed, as if she had all the time in the world. She wore the same effortless confidence she had on the plane, but now it felt heavier, more final. Elena had never felt small before. She did now. Vivian took a slow step forward, letting the door close softly behind her. Elena's pulse thundered. "Why are you here?" Vivian didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the papers on the table. "I assume James delivered the news?" Elena swallowed. "You..." Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "You got what you wanted." Vivian lifted a brow, almost amused. "Did I?" Elena's nails dug into her palms. "You ruined me." At that, Vivian finally smiled. A slow, deliberate smirk. "No, Elena," she said, voice soft but cutting like a blade. "You ruined yourself." Elena's throat tightened. I didn't know who you were." Vivian's smile didn't waver. "You didn't need to." Elena blinked, her breath hitching. Vivian tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, if I had been just another passenger, would you still be sitting here?" Elena knew the answer, and that was the worst part, because the answer was no. If Vivian had been just another passenger, if she hadn't been the owner of Mercer Airlines, Elena would have gotten away with it. Like she always had. The weight of that truth sat between them, cold and undeniable. Elena had never questioned another first-class passenger. She hadn't doubted David Langston. She hadn't doubted Mia Reynolds. But when Vivian Mercer sat there, quietly minding her business, she had assumed she didn't belong, and that was what had destroyed her. Vivian watched the emotions flicker across Elena's face. "You understand now, don't you?" Elena clenched her fists. "So, what? You came here to rub it in?" Vivian exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "No, Elena. I came here to make sure you understand exactly what you lost." Elena looked away, unable to hold her gaze any longer. Vivian stepped closer, her voice lowering. "Let me tell you what's going to happen next." Elena forced herself to meet her eyes. "You're going to leave this room. You're going to clear out your things, and when you walk out of this airport, you won't be walking back in." Elena's stomach twisted. "You're not just banned from working for Mercer Airlines," Vivian continued, slow, ruthless. "I've personally ensured that every major airline knows your name. Every single one." Elena's chest tightened painfully. Her breath came in shaky and uneven. Vivian leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure her next words landed. "You're never flying again." Elena's breath stopped. The room felt smaller. Her throat burned. Vivian pulled back slightly, giving her a long, measured look. "You spent years making passengers feel like they didn't belong," she murmured. "How does it feel knowing you'll never belong here again?" The words shattered something inside Elena. For the first time since this started, since she realized what was happening, she truly felt it. This wasn't just a job, it was her life, and it was over. Vivian let the silence hang before turning toward the door. She reached for the handle, then paused. "By the way," she said, looking over her shoulder. Elena swallowed. "I wasn't even going to fire you at first." Elena's breath hitched. Vivian smiled faintly. "You could have just apologized, could have taken accountability." She shook her head slightly. "But you doubled down. You thought you were untouchable." Her gaze sharpened. "So I touched you." Elena's chest tightened. Vivian didn't wait for a response. She stepped through the door, letting it close softly behind her. Elena couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The finality of it all crashed over her. Her career wasn't just gone. Her entire identity was gone. She wasn't Elena Rowan, senior flight attendant. She wasn't the enforcer of rules. She was nothing. And Vivian Mercer? She had walked away from this with everything. Elena finally let out a shaky breath, and for the first time, she truly felt powerless. Elena sat in the silent room long after Vivian Mercer had walked out. Her body refused to move. Her brain refused to accept reality. She had spent the last 15 years flying across the world, controlling the aisles, enforcing the rules, deciding who was worthy of comfort and who wasn't. The uniform she wore had once given her power. Now, it was nothing more than fabric, and soon it wouldn't even be hers. The security officers outside the door didn't come in to rush her, but she could feel them there, waiting, watching. She knew what came next. She would walk through the halls of this airport for the last time, carrying her things in a small box, just like every other employee who had been escorted out before her. Only this time it would be different, because everyone would know why. Her name had already spread across Mercer Airlines. The whispers had already reached corporate offices. The story had already started leaking to other airlines. Vivian hadn't just taken her job. She had taken her career, her future, her identity. And yet, Elena knew the truth. Vivian didn't take anything. She had handed it over the moment she assumed Vivian didn't belong in first class. The shame of it hit her like turbulence she hadn't braced for. She had been so confident, so sure that she was doing the right thing when she first questioned Vivian on the plane. She had thought she was maintaining order. She had thought she was upholding the rules. But deep down, she knew. She had seen a wealthy, powerful black woman sitting in first class, and she had doubted her. That was the real reason she had asked for the ticket. That was the real reason she had pushed back, even after seeing it. And that was the real reason she had laid her hands on her, a desperate attempt to reclaim control in a situation where she had already lost it. And now, she had lost everything. Her throat burned as she clenched her hands into fists, nails digging into her skin. She had seen this happen to others, crew members who had been caught mistreating passengers, attendants who had let their egos cost them their jobs. But she had never thought it would be her, because she had always believed she was untouchable. She had spent her career walking past economy passengers who barely got a second glance, handing out barely forced smiles to those in first class, deciding, in her own mind, who deserved to be there and who didn't. And now she didn't deserve to be anywhere. Her fingers trembled as she reached up, undoing the first button of her uniform shirt, then the second, then the third. By the time she reached the last one, she was shaking so badly she could barely move. She slid the fabric off her shoulders, folding it neatly, placing it on the table in front of her. It felt like removing her entire existence. Her ID badge came next. She had worn it clipped to her uniform for years, flashing it with confidence as she moved through restricted areas, walking with the authority that came with knowing she was above everyone else. Now, it was a useless piece of plastic. She unclipped it, letting it rest on top of the shirt. The finality of it was unbearable. Her eyes burned. She wouldn't cry. She refused to. Crying was weakness. But as she sat there staring at the uniform she had worn with pride, arrogance, power, she realized she had never felt weaker in her life. A knock on the door startled her. She flinched, blinking rapidly, trying to push the emotion back down. A deep voice followed. Rowan. She recognized the voice immediately. James Connors. Of course. He had been watching the entire time. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. Yes? A pause. Security is ready to escort you out. Her stomach twisted. There it was, the final nail in her coffin. She inhaled sharply through her nose, squaring her shoulders as she stood. Even now. Even as a woman who had lost everything. She still had her pride. She wouldn't let them see her break. She grabbed her things, what little she had left, and moved toward the door. Her fingers hesitated on the handle. One last moment. One last breath. Then she stepped out, and the world she had once ruled over kept moving without her. The airport hallway stretched in front of Elena Rowan like a path she never wanted to walk. Each step forward felt like she was walking deeper into her own failure. Not just the failure of this job, but of everything she had built her identity around. 2 security officers walked on either side of her, not gripping her arms, not restraining her, but guiding her toward the inevitable. A public escort, a walk of shame, the final humiliation. As she moved, she could feel the stares. She could feel the shift in the air around her, the subtle whispers that weren't subtle at all. That's her, the flight attendant who grabbed Vivian Mercer. She lost her job, lost everything. Her jaw clenched. She kept her head high, her posture rigid. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She wouldn't fall apart. Not here. Not yet. The exit doors loomed ahead, the cool glow of daylight pouring through the glass. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had happened, as if she had never existed in this space at all. She was almost at the doors when she heard it. A voice, low, smooth, and powerful. Leaving so soon. Vivian Mercer. Elena stopped cold. The air in her lungs vanished. Slowly, she turned, and there she was. Vivian stood near a sleek black car parked by the curb, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The chauffeur held the door open, waiting for her to step inside. But Vivian hadn't moved. She was waiting for something else, for this. For Elena. The 2 women locked eyes. One with nothing left. One with everything. Elena's throat was dry, but she refused to look away. Vivian took a slow step forward, heels clicking lightly against the polished floor. I wanted to see if you'd actually make it this far, she said, her voice smooth, effortless. Elena exhaled sharply through her nose. I didn't have a choice. Vivian smirked. Number you didn't. A silence stretched between them. Around them, people still moved, passengers rushing to their flights, airline staff pushing carts of luggage, crew members heading toward their gates. But for Elena, the world had narrowed down to this moment. The woman she had tried to humiliate. The woman who had destroyed her. Vivian studied her for a moment, tilting her head slightly. You still don't get it, do you? Elena's fingers twitched. Get what? Vivian let out a slow breath. You thought I fired you because you grabbed my arm. Elena stiffened. Didn't you? Vivian shook her head, almost as if she pitied her. No, Elena. I fired you because you would have done this to anyone. The words sank in like a weight on her chest. You didn't just question me because I was in first class. Vivian continued. You questioned me because you didn't expect me to be there. Elena's stomach twisted violently. She wanted to deny it, wanted to defend herself, wanted to tell Vivian Mercer that she wasn't that kind of person, that she didn't judge people based on anything other than policy, that this was a misunderstanding, that she had made a mistake. But the truth was already there. She had always been this person, and Vivian knew it. Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so that only Elena could hear. You could have let me sit there in peace, she said, her tone soft but cutting like a razor. But you couldn't. Elena swallowed hard, her hands shaking at her sides. You saw a woman sitting in first class, and you needed to remind her that it wasn't hers, Vivian murmured. Elena's chest tightened. You lost your job because you didn't treat me like a customer, Vivian said. You treated me like a mistake. The words landed with brutal finality. Elena couldn't breathe, because she knew what? She knew that Vivian was right, and it had cost her everything. Vivian exhaled lightly, finally stepping back. I wonder, she mused, if you had known who I was from the start, would you have treated me differently? Elena's mouth opened, but nothing came out. It didn't matter. The answer was yes. She would have. Vivian gave a slow, knowing nod. That's the problem. The words hit harder than any termination letter ever could. Elena's chest ached. She felt herself crumbling, breaking apart from the inside, unraveling under the weight of her own choices. And Vivian Mercer? She didn't need to do anything else. She had already won. Without another word, Vivian turned away. She stepped toward her waiting car, sliding into the back seat without hesitation. The chauffeur closed the door behind her, and within seconds the car pulled away from the curb, blending into the steady stream of traffic. Elena watched it disappear. She stood there alone, her entire career, her entire identity, her entire world, gone. And for the first time in her life, she realized something. She had spent years making people feel like they didn't belong. And now, she didn't belong anywhere. The security officer beside her shifted. Let's go. Elena turned back to the exit. And then, with no job, no career, no power, and no future, she walked through the doors of the airport for the last time. That's the end of the story, but now I want to hear from you. What do you think about what happened? Was the flight attendant's punishment fair? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more.